So thanks for everyone for attending today. I really appreciate the time that you've taken out of your schedules to hear what we have to say. So today's really an information session to provide you with the details of the review that we undertook with the department into the VADC. So there are a few key things that we'd like to get across. So the first one is the changes within the department. So if George is in the meeting, she can perhaps go through those. Otherwise, I'm happy to do that. And then we'll get into the VADC review itself. So we'll look at what we did and how we went about it, the key things that we found, and the issues and the recommendations we put forward, and what is happening at the minute in terms of actioning those recommendations. And then if we have time for some questions, that we'll take those as well. Like I said, there's within the Zoom meetings, there's an ability to type in questions and things like that. So if we have some time at the end, we'll look to go through those. Otherwise, as the department, we'll take those questions and the department will provide a response to those in due course. So there's George.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. So George, I might just get you to just do the first slide around the department changes, and then I'll take it from there.
Sure. So apologies, everyone, for being late this afternoon. Essentially, what's happened is in a machinery of government change as part of the division of Health and Human Services into what is now the Department of Health and the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, we, as the AOD commissioning group, were lifted and shifted, if you will, at a divisional level from the primary care branch that Louise Galloway continues to lead into the mental health division that is led by Catherine Wetton at the Deputy Secretary level. And then the branch that we're a part of now is led by Matthew Herkes. Within that, we formed the commissioning branch, and that branch includes mental health, NGOs, and AOD commissioning activity. So it's still very much business as usual. The division in toto is largely focused at the moment on the development of the government response to the Royal Commission into the Victorian Mental Health System final recommendations coming out of that report. And our group is undertaking a process to review those recommendations and look for key points where our activity can hook on to in the AOD space can hook on to those recommendations. But there'll be more advice about that to come as it shores up. I guess while I have the group, I do have a small update to the sector. Again, further information and advice to come following this meeting. The department's happy to advise that there will be a grants round coming towards the AOD sector, and that will provide grants funding targeted to IT, and it will be across COVID activity and VADC activity. So just invite you all to look out for more advice coming very soon about that. It's hot off the press. I was just asked by my director to let you know that that's on its way. But if anyone has any questions about the machinery of government change, please do not hesitate to email me, and I'm happy to have a conversation.
Cool. All right. Thanks, George. So what I'll do, we'll start with the content. I suppose just to talk about what we're engaged to do. So we're engaged by the department to undertake the review based on suppose a result that showed that there was a significant underperformance issue based on the activity data. So we're engaged to have a look at that to see what the causes of that were. So firstly, was there an underperformance issue in the sector, or was it that the data was telling us that there was a problem, and therefore perhaps was there a data quality problem? So we set out to, with sort of on basis, and when we thought about it from a data perspective, we looked at it and said, well, there's probably three main areas where if the quality of the data is an issue, it's either at the point of entry by the sector and clinicians. It can be at the point where that data is extracted and provided to the department. So there's potentially a problem with the extract, or the final step is a problem with the processing of that data by the department. So it's doing things that perhaps is incorrect. So we set out and talked to people across the sector on that basis, if there, to see that if there was a data problem rather than a performance issue. So when we talk through the next few slides, particularly around the findings and the issues, it's we haven't gone and finger pointed or anything like that. We've just looked at what we're told, looked at documents and all those sorts of things, and come up with our findings. So you'll see that there's a few findings that we've made and some recommendations to address those, but it wasn't a finger pointing exercise in any sort of way. In terms of what we did, so we spoke to a number of providers in the sector. So we undertook 18 one-on-one consultations, and they ranged from an hour to 2 hours with those organisations. They were varied, major health and sort of human services providers, those within hospitals, metro, regional, rural, all those sorts of things, because we wanted to be able to get a good cross-section across the sector, those who operated standalone, those in consortia, those in both. So it really gave us a good feel for the issues out there and what they'd experienced and what they were experiencing today. We also undertook a fairly large combined workshop organised with the help of VADA, where we had a further 14 organisations represented, and that was I think probably a couple of hours in that, and that provides some very, very good context for us. And so what that meant was we were able to look at a pretty big slice of the sector, probably bigger than what would normally occur in the time period we have. And so when we looked at it from a service event perspective, we covered about 2/3 of the sector. So we felt that we had a good cross section and some good input on that front. We also spoke to 4 of the major system vendors who service AOD and obviously other sectors, who pretty much make up about 50% in terms of the sector, in terms of their customer base. So we had some good conversations with them about the implementations and about their product. It wasn't a review of their product, it was more about the implementation as they saw it from their side. The method itself, so fairly sort of standard consulting engagement, where we review documentation that currently exists, documentation that did exist. So part of that was also consultation with relevant teams within the department. We looked at the flow of the data as it occurs for VADC. And then in conjunction with all the consultations, we were able to identify what we thought were the issues and looked at all those in detail before finally coming up with our findings and our recommendations to be able to resolve the issues that exist at the minute, and provided that as a report to the department as a draft, and then through to finalising that report. So just as a bit of context, so from a data perspective, and going back to that slide that we had around where we thought sort of 3 areas were, so we have data that's entered by clinicians or anyone, people within the sector who have authority to do that, into your CMS solutions. Now, if you're a standalone, you may use one solution. If you're standalone in consortia, you may use one or more. So there's that bit of complexity as well. But ultimately, the data is entered in some form of system. At the end of each month, that data is extracted and it's loaded onto the MFT portal, which has some initial validation rules conducted over that data, and alerts that the user to any errors with the data that it's checking, and you just go through that process until you have an error-free submission. There are errors and there's also warnings. The feedback was that everyone looked to address the errors and leave the warnings alone. So that goes through its process, becomes error-free, gets loaded, and then it goes through a process of loading into the department's data repositories that it's used for reporting. So out of that, it goes through a process into the data warehouse for the department. At the same time, I think that happens within a couple of days, you have the receipt of the service event statements that service providers can look at to check the activity and the allocations of those, and that allows you to then look at the data, see where funding or the rules haven't found an activity that it can be allocated to, and allows you to resubmit. And then further down, ultimately that data does end up through to VAHI, and that produces the reports which show the activity, which obviously where the perceived underperformance was occurring. So there's quite a few steps, and that's why we were quite interested in all of those steps to see where the issue may lie in terms of the data, and we'll just go through that on the next slide to see. Now, these are the key issues that are coming up, not every single issue, but these are the ones that we felt that were the major impact. So, and again, I stress there's no finger point or anything like that. This is what we found, and where the recommendations will look to try and mitigate these issues and these risks. So there were 5 key things that we found. So we do have an issue with some of the data that's being entered at the point of entry. Now, there's a myriad of reasons behind that. So it's things around some of the CMS solutions not having the validation that's required, some of it around how their system, their workflows operate in comparison to how a clinician operates. Some of it's based on user training. Some of it is based on how the CMS was implemented at the time for those that implemented a new CMS. And we know that there were issues with the implementation and documentation and things like that. So particularly around the rules and how that was provided fairly late or after the event. So, but nonetheless, there is an issue with the data, and how it's being entered, and that obviously then flows through in terms of an impact. So, if you have data issues at the point of entry, then ultimately that impacts the data that comes out the other end. When we talked to a number of organisations, we found that there are some pretty key people. This is not, I suppose, every organisation, but there are some key people in a number of organisations that if they weren't around or they were to leave, then that would be a big impact. They have the biggest understanding. And typically what we found was that the bigger organisations had bigger teams, and they were able to deal with the issues that were being presented, and quite a number had made some significant gains in improving their data. But nonetheless, we had some smaller organisations who really struggled, didn't have the expertise, and would continue to struggle down the track in trying to mitigate the issues that were being reported. We have got some inconsistent use of service event statements. Now, we know that there was a lot of feedback that a lot of service providers didn't understand how to use them or how to apply them. We've made some recommendations on that, but we've had a mixture of some organisations that heavily used it and some that didn't use it at all, and possibly because they weren't quite sure how to. And that's a key thing, because that's the statement that does show you where where that funding hasn't been allocated. So that's a key thing for everyone to be able to look at. Number 4 is concerned more at the department end. So we went through a process to have a look at how that data comes in and the processing that it undertakes as it goes through to the reporting layer to produce the reports. And whilst we didn't see any glaring gaps or major issues, we probably couldn't be completely satisfied that there wasn't any potential errors in there. One of the things around that is around that compliance reporting and reconciliation that probably wasn't there to the extent that we would have expected. So again, we have that in our recommendations. And then the final one was more around the reporting to the sector. So this is in 2 parts. So the sector provides reports on a monthly basis, the extract on a monthly basis. The reports that come out from BAHI are done on a quarterly basis. So we think there should be some consistency in the timing of those things. And also, the earlier that you're able to see it, the quicker that you're able to act on it to then resolve whatever issue that is. The other issue here is also that with the performance reports, that there was inconsistency as to which service providers received them. So it looks to be a fairly manual process in terms of the reports get generated, provided to the apps, the managers, and then provided to the sector who they represent. And so there was inconsistency there as to who received them and who didn't. So we had a number of service providers who saw them and saw them on that quarterly basis, and we had a number who people that we spoke to who hadn't seen them at all or weren't quite sure what we were talking about. So there's some recommendations there about what would need to be done in terms of that. So when it comes to the findings, so we have those issues, but what we found, and again, so there's lots of reasons behind it, but the key issue around that perceived underperformance is that we don't feel that there's an underperformance issue. There were some hits taken with regards to COVID and the number of people that were coming in and things like that, but not to the numbers that are being shown. But the key issue is the data at that point of entry. And so what's happening is that data that's being entered and then flowing through to the department is incorrect in terms of allocating all the funding units, and so that's showing an underperformance. And so, at the bottom there, you'll see that there's 3 reasons, and there's some detail behind it. So, in part of our consultation, we asked about each organisation's implementation. We asked the department and we asked vendors as well. And what we found was that with the implementation of VADC, the new specification, there are also a number of service providers who are impacted by the department's decision to cease the operation of ADIS as well. So not only was part of the sector impacted with VADC changes, but also they needed to go away and implement a new CMS. So we found that a lot of the sector wasn't prepared for that in terms of the dollars that they were needed, the expertise that they needed, but also that the department also wasn't all that well prepared for it as well. There was some major structural changes back then with the department. There was a lot of key people who were on the original VADC specification definition who were no longer there, and there was a number of things that needed to be done by the department prior to that implementation that weren't acted upon. And so, things like the funding units and the rules behind that, like I said previously, that came out, well after the new VADC went live. And so those sort of things needed to be done well beforehand. And also, we think that a lot of vendors weren't adequately prepared either. So with across the board, not with the whole sector, but there was perhaps some expertise that was lacking on how to implement these things. And certainly a number of service providers we spoke to, whilst they acknowledged that yes, they didn't get the support that they required from the department, they also felt that they perhaps didn't do a good job of implementing their CMS either. So we've had, I suppose, the sector relying on the vendors to implement, and vendors perhaps not being expert in terms of a clinician and the workflows and how they go about, when they do see someone that comes through the door. And so they were just trying to do whatever they could from a specification perspective, but perhaps not really sitting down from a user perspective and seeing how their system needed to be implemented and how it needed to be configured. So, which is where you end up with those issues in terms of data entry. The second one, as we've sort of talked about a little bit, is around the documentation from the department to support the sector, and that's been well acknowledged by the department. There's been a lot of work done since that initial implementation, not just around documentation, but in communication, and we've got some recommendations on that as well. And then all of that has resulted in a number of these client management systems not being able to meet the need. They meet the need from being able to, someone hitting a button and extracting the data, but perhaps where they're not meeting the need is at that front end where that data is being entered, and hence we end up with the data quality issues that's happening. So in saying all of that, of the 32 providers that we spoke to, quite a number have since made a number of changes to their CMS solutions, and they've done other work in addition to that around training and all the things, and they're starting to find improvements in their data and obviously in terms of their performance. So but what we find is that there's still a lot of work to go. There's no magic bullet, and so there needs to be some recommendations about how that can be improved, particularly for those organisations in the sector that don't have the capability or the capacity to keep making that investment and keep putting the time into to make the required changes. So from a recommendations point of view, we have 5. So the first one is the key one, and we'll go into a bit more detail in the coming slides. So the first one is around a continual improvement program to address the data quality issues. So we're looking at a number of things to help the sector, whether it's with documentation, training, information sessions, one-on-one, to really help drive that improvement. And so the reason why we say it's a continual improvement program is that we don't think this is a quick fix for everyone. So it's probably over the life of 12 months, and looking at specific issues and how they can be addressed, and in further educating the sector and helping those with the biggest issues. We've also recommended some changes to the service event statements. The key one is around making them a bit more user-friendly, by adding descriptions rather than just codes in the statements, and that's again supported by some further documentation that's part of the continual improvement program. The third one is around the VAHI reporting. So if we can get monthly reporting, then all the better, so that we're consistent with the submission process, and also about how we make sure that every every service provider is able to receive those reports rather than the inconsistency that we're seeing at the minute. And also providing the sector with some further reports around benchmarking. So how you compare to your peers. Obviously data is quite aggregated so that we don't divulge any sensitive information, but really start to make more and better use of the data that's being submitted. The fourth is around that compliance reporting and reconciliation with the data that's being submitted, so that we can be absolutely certain from a department perspective that the processing that is occurring at their end is correct. And the last one is, at the time with our review, there was the annual change process that was underway. And so our recommendation at that point was that only urgent or significant or, urgent or essential changes were made. What we didn't want to try and have was a situation where we were adding things just for the sake of it that increased the burden further and perhaps introduced new problems and new data problems into the whole process. So there were quite a number of submissions made from what we can see there. 21, 22, 18 were endorsed by the sector. There were a few deferred from the previous year, and 13 were new. So I think there are quite a lot more of those that were actually proposed. So that's probably hopefully a good result, and hopefully a lot of those make some material improvement as well and make things easier. Let's grab a drink for a minute. So the next bit's about the continual improvement program. Excuse me. So there's four main bits in this. So as I said, this is not a there's no magic bullet or silver bullet that can solve the issues in quick time. It's going to need a fair bit of work and continual work across the sector to help those most in need. And so there are four parts to it. So the first bit is making sure that we've got the right documentation aimed at the right people in the right language. So whilst a lot of documentation has been written by the department, particularly since the implementation, there's a lot of feedback around it being very technical and hard to understand. So there's an exercise around that to make that easier to understand, and to for where it can be written for non-technical users, for it to be written in a way that they can understand it. The second part is taking some of that documentation and other methods to educate the sector. Again, that'll be in various forms over a period of time. And again, that one will be, in terms of targeted or broad, and need to be prioritized as to who needs the most help. The fourth is around data remediation. So, as an organisation that delivers services around data, one of the things that we know that does happen is that mistakes will still be able to be made, or people will try and get some workaround to lessen their data entry. So, regardless of all the things that are put in place, that we may still find that there's data that comes through that is incorrect. So when that does occur, we need to just make sure that we can make it as easy as possible for people to see those errors and go in and fix those problems and be able to resubmit. And the last one is really around the platforms or the solutions themselves that are being used. So that's really around trying to facilitate a process where it takes the sector, the vendors, and the department together to see what can be done. And obviously, the news from George before around some grants, I think would help in that aspect, particularly where changes are being made to those platforms and need to be funded. So we'll go through each one in a bit more detail over the next 10 minutes or so, and then hopefully that will leave 10 minutes for questions. Now, Simon, did you want me to go through that, or? Would you like to go through it?
Yeah, I can go through them.
Okay, I'll just drive. There you go.
So one of the components that we sort of developed as a recommendation was, as part of the Continual Improvement Program, was to improve the documentation that has been supplied by the department, which is basically done to improve VADC understanding. And the aim of that was to have the necessary materials that are accessible by the sector to conduct the improvement in data quality. This will be delivered by two aspects, one which is data element understanding improvement through the development of educational documentation. As part of the next component, education, there'll be a number of documents that will be created from that, and that should support the sector understanding of the data elements in VADC. A second aspect of the documentation to be created is the reference framework. The reference framework should tie all essential VADC documentation together to be a gold standard for troubleshooting and guidance. So the idea behind that is to connect all the various sources of documentation, including the funded activity letter, the data spec, the business rules, and having some sort of framework to show if there was an issue somewhere, where would you go and which document would you use to sort of conduct that data remediation activity. The next aspect, the next component of the Continual Improvement Program, which is education. Next slide, Rob. Centers around delivery of educational material to the sector. And the main aim for this is to improve sector understanding through education. There are four aspects to this. One of them is a targeted one-on-one training. This will be basically done based on, I guess, agency prioritization. We understand that there are a number of agencies that are really struggling with some of the data quality issues that they have with VADC reporting. And what the department plans to do is create a prioritized list and work through some of these struggling providers, work with these struggling providers to conduct one-on-one training with them and work through the main data quality issues with them. This is expected to be resource intensive on the department side. So hopefully that will help some of the providers that are struggling with the lack of capability and capacity to tackle their data quality issues. Another one of the aspects of this education component is the regular forums to be held with the sector in terms of educating the sector on any new documentation that comes up from the department or any new changes to the VADC. This is in line with more recent forums that were held by the department, such as when the department started to, I guess, disseminate the service event statements, and also having some training sessions or information sessions around that and using the service event statements. We believe that that should be continued with having more regular forums with the sector on various topics. The third component of the education is the creation of a VADC fact sheet on how the department actually uses VADC data and what they do with it. This is more so around giving more detailed description around how and where the data goes and how the data is actually used by the department beyond just motherhood statements, such as VADC data is used for funding or VADC data is used for policy planning, but a fact sheet that goes with a bit of detail behind how that data is actually used in funding and how that data is actually used in the formation of policy. The last aspect is e-learning resources. We believe that there should be an e-learning portal on the VADC website that should house all the educational materials or reference materials for the VADC. So that was one of the recommendations. The next slide.
I think part of that as well was also that documentation and any potentially how-tos and things like that. So
yeah,
one of the issues that people noted was trying to get to the right people in the department, but certainly as a first port of call, if just like with a whole range of other services you find in the community, if you can go somewhere first to see if something's there that you can utilize, then that probably saves everyone time, and if you can get your answer that way, all the better. But obviously, after that, then there's the department resources to look on as well. Next slide.
Yep, next slide. So this third component is around data remediation, and it really just centers around the post-submission tools that are available by the department. So this recommendation of, well, this aspect of the Continual Improvement Program just supports the improved and ongoing use of the available data remediation tools, and also promoting the use of available departmental tools to improve data quality. This will be a little bit two ways. So we know that there are two error reports that come out from the MFT portal. One, which is the validation report post-submission, as well as the service event statement. So these two reports should be used more regularly, I guess, as a tool for data remediation, and also the need to improve the understanding behind delivering that. Using those tools.
Yep, I think, and also, I mean, it's well known now that I think one of the issues very early on was that there was an assumption that when you loaded your data onto the portal or your extract and it passed the validation, that there was an assumption that the data was okay. And obviously that turned out from a format and all those sort of things, it was okay, but clearly there was all the funding rules that were being applied further down the track, which were then in the service event statement. So we just need to make sure that that's very well defined about what each one does, and to make sure that portal and those reports that are provided are as easy to use as possible.
Yeah, and the last components around CMS improvements. Obviously, there needs to be some work around improving the CMS solutions that are used by agencies, and this is, well, one of the main aims is also to improve the current CMS solutions, but also the vendor relationships. We understand that there was a lot of three-way communication channels between vendors, providers, and department. And one of the working together aspect will be centered around the formation of user groups, initially to be facilitated by the department. So user groups are usually, hosted by the vendor, and they work with their client base in delivering any changes or taking feedback into things that could be improved with their solutions. We noticed that this was not common with the vendors that were supplying CMS solutions to the sector, and one of the recommendations was for the department to facilitate the formation of these user groups, and hopefully, like, as time goes on, those become more formal, and the department can sort of step away from that and let things run.
Yeah, part of it, sorry, was also to the time I mentioned about the three-way. So we heard a lot where sector was going to the department, vendors were going to the department separately. There's all these separate conversations, and potentially, depending on who you spoke to, was the advice that you received. So at least in the short term, by having these as joint sessions where concepts or definitions of things and all that need to be ratified or confirmed, we can do that I suppose with everyone together, and that way there is no miscommunication or different advice traveling up and down the chain.
And the last point for the CMS platform improvements was to work with vendors and service providers in improving the current CMS solutions through either one, embedding validation, or two, creating better alignment of solutions to clinical workflows. A lot of the issues we found for point one was that there were not a lot of drop downs or configurations that allowed clinicians to conduct proper data entry, and working with vendors to embed that validation could potentially improve the data quality. The second point was around alignment to clinical workflows, which is basically some of the solutions were developed in a way that was not conducive for clinicians to enter data in the way that they work. So that was around working with vendors in designing that data flow or the clinical workflow into the solution to assist with that improved data entry.
Okay, thank you, Simon. So in terms of what's happening at the minute, sorry, let's go back to here. So our understanding is there's a summary. So we provided the full report over to the department. I believe that the department has provided a summary report to the sector. There are information sessions like this being held with the sector. I think we have 3 or so in total. We also have one with the vendors as the last one. In terms of the specifications themselves, so those urgent or only essential changes being made, and some initial work around, the necessary changes required around compliance reporting, reconciliation, and obviously the things around those error reports and the service event statements to make them easier to use and increase the uptake in their use, and then also the VAHI reports themselves. So I think, we think the easiest starting point is to make sure that everyone is receiving them, and so that they're able to look at those reports and action those, and then beyond that, looking at can those reports be provided in line with the monthly submission, and then are there other reports that can be provided that are just outside a performance report for your organisation that's more around benchmarking. And then the final one is getting that continual improvement program in terms of the recommendations we've made, and going that level deeper in stipulating the activities that are required and putting a plan in place for executing that program. So we've been working with the department on that over the last few weeks, and that's just been pretty much in its final stages in being signed off. And so that basically sets out for each of those 4 all the activities, what the deliverables out of those activities are, who needs to be involved in terms of the department, the timing of that, and then dependencies on that as well. And then we've produced, I suppose, a supporting Gantt chart out of that plan that puts those activities in a time frame over as I said at the outset, a fairly decent period of time. There's a lot of organisations that potentially need help, and so that's something that department, one of the activities around prioritising that help and who needs that one-on-one versus who needs help more broadly. So that'll get underway shortly, I suspect. So I think that's probably it from us in terms of the actual content. There's a few minutes to go. I might just stop the sharing and see if I can see any questions.
Thanks. Rob, there's actually lots. There's you know, in the last 5-6 minutes or so, there's lots of questions both in the Q&A and in the chat. Some simple, some requiring longer, complex, more thought out answers. So just wondering what the process forward is for some of those questions, for the sector to absorb your presentation, to potentially come back with some additional queries and questions which you could scoop up from today, if not elsewhere.
Yeah. So,
and then the other, sorry, go on.
No, you go, finish that.
The other thing that occurs to me, just in terms of talking about that work plan, there's a lot of deliverables in there, bringing the sector along that journey and where we're up to, you know, with that Gantt chart that you mentioned or whatever, what's happening when, how are we tracking against all of those recommendations? Well, we're going really well here, we've done this, this and this, but we've still got to do that. And so that there's some confidence that the recommendations are being actioned and that, you know, there's activity being undertaken. So there's maybe you could respond to a couple of those points.
Well, George is probably better at some of the department ones than me, just in terms of resourcing and things like that. So I might put that one to her. Not a handle intentionally, but
no worries. So the department's finalising arrangements for the resourcing for the delivery of the work plan. Some of the elements in that work plan will be delivered internally by my team in AOD System Performance, and then also within VAHI. Actually, while we're talking about VAHI, I might just also note that the machinery of government change has also seen the mental health and alcohol and other drugs data and reporting teams come back together into the one entity of VAHI as well. So system performance in the commissioning space and reporting and data in VAHI will be working together collaboratively across a number of those actions that are within the work plan. I'm probably not in a position to speak with confidence to the progress of some of the items that are being led by VAHI. But what I would say is, just reiterate, it's one of my, it's probably actually my top priority to lock down the resourcing for the delivery of the work plan. But we're also keen to provide updates and answer questions as they're coming out of this workshop, feedback, what have you, concerns. So what I was going to propose is a frequently asked questions fact sheet style document that can be provided with perhaps the link to the recording of this session today. And then if there are other questions that people have or thoughts they'd like to provide back to the department and Data Agility about the session today and what we've all learned, please send them to myself, and I'll coordinate the response of those questions and feed them into the FAQ document that'll include the link to this session today. We'd be very, very keen to hear from people as well.
So George, you're undertaking, if I'm hearing you right, to review the questions in the chat and Q&A and to provide responses to those questions. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And I hope that it will be useful for all those stakeholders who weren't able to attend today but might have liked to, and ensure that everybody stays as informed as they possibly can. So I will hold off on answering the questions that have been put in the chat until there's been a few days, maybe even the weekend, for participants with us to consider, digest, and they may have questions or concerns which we'll address in the FAQ document as well. And I'll work diligently to ensure that that document and the link to this recording is out for everybody to use as soon as possible next week.
And we for those online, VADA is happy to receive questions or any further comments and can forward them on as well if that's convenient to go through that pathway. So just in terms of, I mean, I really like the idea of just the sector, well, one, having a look at that final report, if that's possible, if you could somehow get that to us, that we could then disseminate that, that'd be really helpful. So that the sector can have a good look at that. But also that work plan, I think understood, would there be access to the work plan and how you're ticking off and tracking, and then opportunity to feed into that? Because I expect that the sector, and I'm making some assumptions here, but that we've heard, Rob, thank you for your presentation today, but there'll be lots of questions and comments about that. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? Don't forget to think about this. Don't forget to think about that. So I guess I'm wondering, I'd prefer it not to be just a set and forget, here's the work plan and off we go, but that there's input from the sector and key people who know, hold a wealth of information about this to shape and influence the solutions.
Yeah, so sorry, so the work plan itself doesn't go to a level where we say, well, it's only this or only this. So I think that part can come into some of the forums and those one-on-ones as well to get that. So they're not aimed to be they happen once and that's it. So they should be on a continual basis. So I think some of that will also come during those type of sessions.
So what I would also add to Rob's comments is I'm happy to consider dissemination of the final report. There would need to be a level of de-identification taken to it as a treatment, because there are sections in that report that represent points of consultation with stakeholders where they perhaps weren't talking in a voice where they knew that would go into a publicly released final report. So the summary report was intended as an interim measure to ensure that people felt they had advice from the final report without having to put into the limelight contributions by stakeholders. But
we haven't received the summary report. The sector hasn't seen the summary report, I think.
Okay, no worries. I'll send that around immediately.
Happy for my comments to stay in the report.
I don't think we went to individual comments or anything like that.
Maybe I can do an amendment.
But if I could just reiterate, bringing the people who have joined us today and the sector along in the solution, and as part of the solution, that we work collaboratively to achieve that. Emphasise that.
Yep.
Thank you.
So Scott, are you guys able to extract those chat or questions and things like that?
Yep, the chat will auto extract, and I'll keep this open for just a minute after we end the meeting, just so that I can make sure I captured all of the last questions.
And if you have any more that you want to put in, please do so now, or do that via VADA, and we can capture that as well. Any further reflections that you might have after this.
Yeah.
All right, it's after 3, so we'll finish up. Thanks, George, for joining us. Thanks, Rob and Simon, for your report and for updating us on the project. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you again soon.
No problem. Okay. Bye.